The Anunnaki of ancient Sumerian texts were a council of gods and goddesses, perhaps the earliest known form of a consultative group. A concept that in modern business is referred to as the board of directors.
Well, I would ask a question about corporate governance. I recognize that companies are social structures, and we've imported the corporate concept from the West. But at the end of the day, people interact between themselves within the corporation through the social mores of the society from which they have sprung up. We have devised corporate governance in the last 10 years based on the Anglo-Saxon model of how the board should interact within itself and with the management. I wonder whether you have any suggestions on how the cultural moorings of Indians can be better played out in the way our corporate governance rules and procedures are currently laid out, so that we can get a more effective form of corporate governance, even if it's not so efficient.
The question is, how are they working together? If they're working well together, then it's fine. What happens when there's conflict? Then who becomes more powerful? And usually it's not either or. You have this impersonal set of rules that are, it's almost as if you have the commandments, you have the king, and you have the prophets. And each one is checking who is following the rules. Right. There is a level of suspicion that you know, on his own, the king is perhaps not going to follow the rules, and he must be constantly watched. Now, if I'm the promoter and I have done the business on my own without board and have done a successful business, now as I grow in size, perforce the rules force me, because I need more funds, I need to create a board of directors. Suddenly I see that just because I've got access to more funds, my freedom is being taken away from me. Yeah. That same freedom that enabled me to grow the business is being taken away from me, and therefore the relationship starts getting soured. If you look at the biblical examples, there are constantly stories of King David trying to do what he wants to do. And he's constantly being warned by the prophets, you cannot do what you want to do. You have to align within the rules. And there is this great tension between the king and the prophet. For example, he has an extramarital affair which is forbidden, and he wants to build a temple which is forbidden. And he's constantly doing things because he wants to fulfill his individual will, rather than what is the appropriate conduct by the commandments and by the law and the voice of God. And that narrative is very strong in the Bible of you cannot be an individual. You have to be subservient to an impersonal entity called the law. Now these are the sources from which the idea of governance has come into India. The idea of it is relatively alien, because the focus over here is focus on the king. If the king is an honest man, then things will fall into place. So the education of the kings played a lot of role. But today what we are saying is we want Ram, and to create Ram we will produce a set of rules. Rules don't make Ram.
I'm curious, even the kings in ancient India must have had a council of ministers. Ministers that advised the king and also kept the king in check to some extent by offering him the right advice, nudging him constantly in the right direction. Is there a parallel in our scriptures that, albeit draws from the Western model of governance, but Indianizes that?
You see, the king was never kept in check. The council of ministers was there to counsel, to advise the king, but ultimately the king was like what is called a yajman, and he's performing the great sacrifice, a yajna. And he is doing the swaha. All his decisions are the swaha. And what comes from the yajna, whatever comes from the yajna, is the result of his actions, his decisions. So swaha in the ancient days, what is a swaha? You pour things into the fire. Once you throw it out, it doesn't come back. It's your decision. And what comes back to you is the direct result of your decisions. Nobody keeps you in check. So there are ministers, and there is the rishi and the pandit, everybody sitting around you, supporting you to do the yajna. But ultimately, in the yajna, who is the yajman? Who is the decision maker? Who takes accountability for the yajna? Is the board taking accountability or the CEO taking accountability? It comes down to that.
In today's day and age, it would be almost impossible to live without a set of rules constantly telling people that, hey, if you're not doing what these rules set out for you to do, then you're doing the wrong thing. How do we leave companies entirely to the governance of an individual? How do we not build in checks and balances through a board? And yet, how do we create equality between the board and that CEO or the promoter or the king?
See, implicit in your questions is that if the rules did not exist, there would be anarchy and chaos.
To some extent.
You see, this is a Western construct. What do I mean by that? The idea that laws create order, and before, if you remove laws, there is no order and there is chaos, is a Western construct. In the Indian construct, if there were no laws, it's not chaos that exists. Therefore, in the Western mythology, the images of dragons exist. If you read Mesopotamian mythology, you read Greek mythology, there's always this image of dragons which exist. And it is the great hero, the great king, who comes and tames the dragon and creates order with rules. But in the Indian context, if you take away the human being, what exists? If you take away man completely, what exists is nature, Prakriti. And what is nature? Nature is not disorganized. Nature is not chaotic. What you have in nature is the instinct of survival. And only the fit survive, and might is right. Now that is what exists in nature. So when I create culture, I am creating the very opposite. It is not might has right, meek have rights too. So it is about a world where I go out of my way to help the helpless. Now how do I do that? Will the rules make me do that, or do I genuinely want to do that? If I don't want to help the helpless, if despite being a human being I want to behave like an alpha male, which rule is going to, then the rules will not control me.
In short, your response to Gopal's question is that no, there is no Indian code of governance that can be created, or a code of governance that is contextualized to our conditioning here in India. There is no such thing, because no set of rules can actually help you be a better person.
Let me give you an example of rules in form of a story. You see, when you read the Ramayana, you know, one of the most famous lines in the Ramayana is Raghukula Riti Sada Chali Aayi, Pran Jaya Pan Vachan Na Jaya. It's a very famous line. When you read this line, you have to ask yourself the question, when Ram goes to the forest in the Ramayana, is he obeying his father or is he obeying the law? What do you think?
Well, his father's word is the law, so he's obeying both, isn't he?
Look at what the father is saying. Raghukula Riti, that means the law of the clan is more important, which is the Raghu family, the dynasty to which he belongs to. Is it Ram obeying the father, or is Ram obeying the law?
Well,
it's a very interesting line if you look at
considering that there is no conflict in obeying either one, because both are saying the same, and the law or the custom of his family or the tradition is to follow what your father says, he is obeying both.
Right. Now let's look at the same narrative, and it continues over time. At the last chapter of the book, the same law says, the king's wife shall be of unblemished reputation.
He followed that as well, didn't he?
Exactly. And so what is the narrative inadvertently saying? Be careful of laws. If you stick to them and don't look at the spirit of the law. Why did laws come into being? It came into being to help the helpless, to move out of the animal desire to dominate, and for the might to have rights. You had laws so that the meek have rights too. But look at this law. An innocent, pregnant woman is being told to leave the forest because the law becomes more important. And Ram is Maryada Purushottam. So too much of alignment to the law. See, Indian scriptures are always wary of laws, because laws seem to be are kind of removed from context, while Indian thought is all about context.
We can't in business create rules that are contextual to every business and its leader and its future.
Yes.
So we need something that's uniform. That's the honest truth of this day and age.
Yes.
Is there anything that is more suited to the Indian way of thinking as opposed to importing what is a Western code of governance and then trying to fit it onto Indian companies and saying, hey, we understand that you guys are not all equal, but the board is supposed to stand up to the CEO and the CEO is supposed to defer to the board, so make it work.
You see, I think this is where the humanity has to be worked on. See, everywhere we are talking about a code transforming people into good people. See, the whole thing is, I need a code to make me good. That it comes down to this one single argument. Give me this law which will make me good. That's a very difficult thing to achieve. We have to ask ourselves, are we working towards creating leaders who know why they are doing what they are doing? These are things that are not even being addressed. We are focusing so much on the law because we have given up on human beings. We're saying human beings don't work, so processes are important, structures are important, laws are important, conducts are important, and you have constitutions being changed every day. You can change Indian constitution 20,000 times. That will not make our politicians honest.
So the answer to Gopal's question is that boards at best can play an advisory role, but they cannot really keep the CEO in check. They cannot stop him from exploiting a loophole if he has decided to, nor can they make him a better person than he actually is.
Yes, absolutely. And you see, in Indian thought, while it will not be there in the rational world, is that for every action there are consequences. If not in this life, then in the next.
Governance is always referred to as the spirit of governance because, like we've said, governance needs to go beyond what the rule book says. It's not just adhering to the rules, it's about taking into account and keeping in mind the interest of all stakeholders, right? So I have a couple of questions that to me seem like governance conflicts, and I want to know what our scriptures have to say about them. Can the end justify the means? Because I think at various points in the Mahabharata, as laid out in your book as well, Krishna violates every rule of war. And yet he does that so as to be able to help the Pandavas win. Can the end justify the means?
You see, look at this. The assumption is if the rules are followed, then good will happen. This is what we are saying, right? If the rules are followed, then good will happen. So rules are almost good. First of all, this very idea is alien to Indian because rules exist in a context. And the same rule in a different context may not apply. For example, you have a rule that says that if you obey the father, you are a good son, you should obey. Now, in the Mahabharata, there is Bhishma, who obeys his father. His father says one day that, he doesn't say it, but implies that he's unhappy because he's fallen in love with a young woman. So the young son, instead of which is Bhishma, he was called Devdutt then. He discovers that his father has fallen in love with a fisherwoman. And he says that, he goes to the fisherwoman and says, I want you to marry my father. And the woman says that, I won't marry unless my children become kings. And the only way my children become kings is if you give up the throne. And he says, I give up the throne. And then he says that, anyway, what if your children fight my children? And he says that I will never marry again. So, the son sacrifices for the father. Now, what seems good in the Ramayana, because the son is sacrificing, in the Mahabharata has a terrible effect, because by that one act, he destroys the family tree. Because all children born after that are not born normally, they're born through the intervention of sages and the gods. And what ends up is the Mahabharata, the whole fight for the kingdom. So what appears like a good thing, because the son obeyed the father in the Ramayana, is a terrible thing in the Mahabharata. The same action. So we have to be very careful when we say rules equal to good, because as every good lawyer knows, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are important. Now coming to the Mahabharata, when you're talking about ends and means, let's ask ourselves what happens at the end of the Mahabharata war. On one side you have the Kauravas, and the other side is the Pandavas. And let's ask ourselves, who would like this victory? So at the end of the war, 100 of the Kauravas are killed. Good, the villains are dead. So that must be naturally law. But let's look at the narrative, and this is unfortunately in modern retellings we don't focus. Each and every son of the Pandavas is killed. So you have 5 sons born of Draupadi. So Draupadi has, the villains have been killed, but all her 5 sons are killed. What kind of victory is that? So, well, I have got the kingdom, but your children are dead. And what happens to Krishna, who has made the war? He's cursed that 36 years later, his entire family will be destroyed. So in fact, everybody is losing. So the question is, the story is not about winning. Mahabharata war is about empathy. It comes down to empathy. Remember, when the war is being fought, Krishna goes to Duryodhana and says, I want peace, let's make peace, let's make peace. And Duryodhana says, no, I don't want to have peace. You see, there was an agreement, a contract, that for 13 years, these people who have gambled away the kingdom will go to the forest. When they come back, they will get the kingdom. So it's a very clear contract, right? At the end of that period, when one part has been filled, the other part has to give his end of the bargain.
And
right?
Duryodhan violates the contract or defaults on
He
it.
defaults, and then Krishna says, okay, fine. And he argues on calendar, he argues on time, he argues that, maybe they didn't live for 12, but I caught them before that, and he keeps arguing technicalities. And finally Krishna says, enough. What about giving them 5 villages? And he says, no. Then he says, okay, how about a house with 5 rooms? And he says, no, not a needle point of territory will I give. Now you see, this is where his intention is being released. Till then, he was following the law, he was following the rules, he was well within the rules, right? But his intention was dishonorable, and so he had to be pushed to the corner. And when he was pushed to the corner, what did you have?
It resulted in war, which ended up destroying most people's fortunes.
Yes,
right?
but you see, if the war had not been fought, this king would have thrived. A king who doesn't care for anybody else. So what kind of a society would have existed?
But what kind of God do we worship in Krishna when he broke every rule of that war just to ensure that the Pandavas win? I understand that his intent was to restore or to ensure that a king like Duryodhan does not get to continue. But yet, how can the end justify the means?
What is the end of the Mahabharata? Not the war. You see, that is the 12th chapter of the Mahabharata. There are 6 more chapters after this, which again is not part of common translation.
Right. Yeah.
What is the original name of the Mahabharata? The original name of the Mahabharata is called Jaya. Jaya.
As in victory?
Victory. But there is another word for victory in India. It is called Vijaya. Now, why have they given this strange name Jaya to this book? Because you see, the story does not end with the war. There is a bloodshed. Nobody is a winner, as you can see. Krishna says a king who behaves like an animal, then the society is as good as not existing. So the Kauravas are killed, Pandavas suffers. At the end of 36 years, we are told that the Pandavas die, and the eldest brother, Yudhishthira, who is supposed to have created this wonderful kingdom where all rules are followed and everything, goes to heaven. And when he goes to heaven, he finds over there imagine, he enters heaven. The moment he enters heaven, the first thing he sees are the 100 Kauravas.
In heaven?
In heaven. Now this is called the Svarga Aharonika Parva, the last chapter. And when he goes there, he sees, and remember, while he's walking up the mountain, he's given up everything. He's given up his kingdom, he's given up his wealth, his clothes, his cows, his gold. His wife dies and he doesn't turn around to look at him because they've given up relationships. His brothers die, he doesn't look back. He just keeps walking front. And when he comes to the gates of heaven, he's this great man who's given up everything. And when he enters, what does he see? He sees the Kauravas there. And he's furious. And he says, how can these murderers be kept over there? Where are my brothers? Why should my brothers not be here? Why should my wife not be here? And he starts arguing. And they show the brothers are in hell.
So all the rest of the Pandavas are in hell?
Because in those 36 years, perhaps they were not all that great. We don't know. I mean, there are stories about it, details. For example, Draupadi favored one of the husbands. So Bhima was a glutton, and Arjuna was very insecure and conceited. So these kind of...
These were the reasons for which they were banished to hell.
Hell. But the point is not that. The gods ask, why are you so angry, Yudhishthira? And he says the gods are being unfair. Because the villains cannot be in heaven, right? Now imagine, why is Vyasa putting this twist in the tale? Because he wants to communicate something deeper. And he says, you know what, Yudhishthira, you great king, you have given up everything except your anger. For 36 years, you have killed these guys, right? They have been punished. You have ruled their kingdom for 36 years. So you have punished them. So why haven't you forgiven them yet? And if you can't forgive them, if you can't purge your heart of anger, what have you actually given up? Why should heaven be yours?
So he doesn't get a place in heaven?
No, he's being asked that. Because unless you purge your heart of anger and forgiveness, you cannot enter heaven. And that is Jaya. Not victory over others, but victory over yourself. And that will only happen when there is empathy in your heart. Yudhishthira does not display empathy. He is unable to forgive the villain. It's not eternity. They have done the crime, they have paid for it. This is what, remember, while Ramayana talks about the perfect king, Mahabharata talks about the process of creating the perfect king. And the process of perfect king is for the CEOs and the leaders and the managers to ask themselves, why are they doing what they are doing? Is it coming from exploitation? To exploit people and make lots of money and then travel in your BMW? Is that the point of living? Because then you're no different from the lion, the alpha male. In ancient India, you were supposed to sit on the throne, the lion throne, which means you're not supposed to be the lion. You have to outgrow the lion.
You have to conquer the lion.
The lion within you, your desire to be this great alpha male and dominate society. You don't have to be that. It's not about Vijaya, defeating the other alpha males and being wary of them. It is about Jaya, which is conquering the animal inside you that enables you to not be Duryodhana and say not a needle point of territory. I will not give an inch in negotiations, because you get this false sense of triumph. It is about discovering that why do kings exist? You don't exist to make money for yourself. You exist to ensure wealth is generated and distributed so that everybody in your kingdom can discover the purpose of life.
So does Yudhishthir get a place in heaven?
Eventually everyone does.
But the rest of the Pandavas, the 4 of them, are in
There
hell.
are infinite lives. This is just one of their many lives.
Okay, at the end of that life, does he get a place in heaven? I'm
Wait
curious.
for the next episode.
That's my technique. I have one last question on this. I can understand why the Pandavas went to hell. You explained it. Draupadi favored 1 out of 5 husbands. Bhima was a glutton. Arjun was vain. Yudhishthira still held on to his anger. Why in heavens did the Kauravas get to be in heaven, considering that they were no better off?
You see, it's like asking during appraisals that, I don't think he's good enough to get the raise, right? Guys whom you hate get the raise, and guys whom you love don't get the raise. So we decide we know the rules of God.
Well, at least the rules of raises. If not the rules of God.
The best time to meet people is post-appraisal, and if they have everybody imagines who they consider as heroes and who they consider villains, and somehow it never matches that of the management. The management has heroes and villains of their own, and it doesn't match. The upstream and downstream gaze is very different, and everybody believes they know who belongs in heaven and who belongs in hell.
So I'm not saying that the Kauravas belong in hell. I'm curious to know that despite everything that they did, deny the Pandavas their rightful kingdom, be such horrible people, why did they end up going to heaven?
Well, the reason is because the land on which they died was considered to be very auspicious. So it was just luck.
It was just luck?
Good luck. They died on a land which was considered to be holy. That's all. But you see, the fact is, your stay in heaven is not permanent. You see, it's not heaven as, again, this is the problem of the Eastern, it's not heaven with a capital H. It is heaven with a small h, which is
It's not
Swarga.
a destination, it's a stopover
It's a stopover, because you will live in heaven for only a limited duration of time. And then you will move on to the next life and the next life. So it is like, Swarga is a place where you go when you have got enough equity. And hell is the place where you go when you have too much debt.